You're writing about U.S. Israel relations. You wrote a very, very influential article in Foreign Affairs about Gentile Zionism. What got you interested in this topic?
Well, you know, if you're interested in American foreign policy, the subject of Israel does come up from time to time. And the Middle East, you know, every now and then the Middle East rears its head. So there's naturally an interest there. But also, I suppose, you know, while I am somewhat ignorant in the world of political science and theory, but it's clear that the way I think about foreign policy doesn't mesh well with some sort of realist theory, especially sort of the idea of the state as a, you know, as a black box or a billiard ball that is just, that internal political forces simply don't matter. And that's never something I've believed. It has always seemed to me that internal politics in all kinds of ways affects the foreign policy, not just of this state, but of most states. Even in non-democratic states, I think that's true. And so, in some ways, you know, Mearsheimer's book is the sort of acme of this kind of thinking. But America's Israel policy is a huge problem for realists like Mearsheimer, who think that, you know, objectively speaking, there is no good rationale for the American-Israel alliance. So how do you save realism while explaining Israel? Right? That's actually what led, I think, Mearsheimer and Walt to write that book. Right. And what they have to come to save realist theory is to say, well, yes, in this one case, right, a lobby. So they're forced to say the Israel lobby is different from all other lobbies, which is a very strange place to get, very hard. And you can only defend that argument by saying that Jews are different from other people, either in terms of their power or their focus or whatever it is. And so there was, even before the Mearsheimer-Walt book, there was a kind of a climate in American foreign policy that sort of everybody knew that Jewish pressure is what shapes American policy on Israel. And that sort of bothered me, as, again, you know, going back to growing up in a civil rights, Martin Luther King tolerance household. You know, it smelled a little anti-Semitic to me, and it bothered me as a concept. But it also struck me that it was an indication of really very subpar thinking about American foreign policy in general, and it kind of annoyed. My mother was a very great housekeeper and kept the house neat. I don't have that, but I'm kind of an intellectual housekeeper, and I like my intellectual house to be neat, and I don't like an intellectual mess. And it seems to me that that there's a lot of bad thinking about this. Also, beginning in the Clinton administration, the State Department started asking me to do lectures on American foreign policy and various topics around the world. And so, you know, at this point I must have been to maybe 30 or 40 countries where I'll, you know, do a lot of lectures with students, meetings with faculty and cabinet, you know, sort of intellectuals, journalists, all kinds of people. It's actually a great way to travel. And the government pays for it, so it's even better. But as I did that, I found that this kind of thinking that, of course, the way you understand American policy in the Middle East is the Jewish influence is so widespread globally. Yeah. And you know, if you think about it, what that says about, for example, American democracy, if you are at all logical, it says that American democracy is a charade. Either you're like Mearsheimer and you say there's one lobby that's different from all other lobbies, or you sort of say that American democracy, the plutocrats run every issue in America. Liberal politics is just a screen or a mask our apparent democratic processes. And I think a lot of intelligent people around the world actually do believe this, at least with part of their minds, because people can kind of entertain somewhat conflicting ideas in the same way. So I wanted to start setting the record straight, and trying to sort of get at the real sources, it seems to me, of American support for Israel. And what I have found, and I'm, as you know, because poor man, I just dumped 11 chapters on you, and we're going to be doing a study group together on this book this year. The more work I've done on it, the more I've been convinced that the American Jews are neither historically nor even today the main motor of American support for Israel. And I understand it on a much richer level even than I did when I wrote the Foreign Affairs piece, but that was an early venture into this subject. And you look at the historical record, and basically non-Jewish Americans have a 200-year record of interest in promoting the restoration of the Jews in the Middle East, long before there was a Jewish Zionist movement. The Blackstone Memorial, which you guys have read about in that article, if you haven't seen it in other places, you have the entire establishment of the East Coast signing on to the idea that President Benjamin Harrison Benjamin Harrison, the grandson, should use his influence to get a Jewish state established in the Middle East. You can look at 1923, the Lodge Fish Resolution passed nearly unanimously in both houses of Congress, without Jewish lobbying in any of these cases. This last one ended up supporting the Balfour Declaration and stating that it was the policy of the United States, partly so we would have the ability diplomatically to interfere or to speak to Britain if it wasn't upholding the Balfour promises. In fact, at the time of the Lodge Fish Resolution, a lot of the opposition came, in fact, from American Jews. Henry Morgenthau, Wilson's ambassador to the Ottoman Empire, and probably the most influential Jewish political figure of the time, took out a full-page ad in the New York Times against it, and it was signed by 200 and some of the country's sort of leading influential Jews. So, there's a historical record that tells you one thing, and a universal belief that something else is true.
An historical record that really hasn't been well written about. You can find it in Michael Oren's book and so on, but it's
little
not like
patches.
but there isn't a sustained interest in it. It's interesting.
Well, also, no one really has sort of looked at what they'll sort of point, and Michael's done a great job with it. They'll sort of point to isolated examples, but they won't sort of try to figure out, okay, why and what are they thinking, and how is this related to their other thinking about the rest of the world. This is something that I've really found the last few months. I've been trying to write about Truman's policy between 1945 and 1948, which is sort of remains the kind of, this is the moment when people will say, oh, this is when the Jews really, Harry Truman betrays the national interest because of the Jewish lobbying, and here's Marshall and Kennan telling him don't do it, but Clark Clifford, the scummy political lobbyist, tells him go ahead, you'll get the Jewish vote. People tell the story that Truman actually lost the Jewish vote in 1948, that Dewey and Henry Wallace both outbid him for the Jewish vote on Israel. He was actually the least pro-Israel of the three major candidates in 1948. Again, no record. But what I've found is that the problem with most of the historical writing about U.S. Israel Relations is that books on U.S. Israel relations are only about U.S. Israel relations. And in fact, for most of the Americans involved, this is only one small part of the world and not the most important issue they're dealing with. So when we think about Truman in the spring and summer of 1948, okay, as all of this stuff is unwinding in Palestine, Stalin is moving toward the Berlin airlift, or to the Berlin blockade. This is the height of the animosity between the communists. This is when people are seriously worried that the communists will take over in France and in Italy. How much time do you think Truman is spending thinking about a communist takeover of France and a military standoff against the Soviet Union in Berlin compared to what's happening in Palestine? And looking at the political forces that people are working with, but also, you see, looking at the intellectual framework they were dealing with. So why do Woodrow Wilson and Henry Cabot Lodge, who disagree about almost everything, why do they both support the Balfour Declaration? What is the American view of world history and politics and American strategy in which the Balfour Declaration looks like a common sense way forward? Okay, that's the stuff that nobody has really written about.
Can you answer that question in a few sentences?
I can try. I'm trying to answer it in a book. We'll see what I can do in a few sentences.
It's a fantastic question.
Well, if you look at, here's the context. Americans were incredibly optimistic in the first half of the 19th century about where history was going. Because for a non-Jewish, sort of white Christian American looking at world history in 1825, 1840, in that zone, what you see is, okay, ancient world, grand, wonderful, then Dark Ages, horror, Catholicism, superstition, then Reformation. The light begins to dawn, leading in England to the glorious revolution. First, true religious principles are rediscovered, then the true principles of civil and economic life are discovered. So, glorious revolution to Adam Smith, to American Revolution. All right, and it's world historical. Meanwhile, then not only do the British, the side of relative good, beat Napoleon, and the Industrial Revolution starts, which makes absolutely clear that the English-speaking world is going to be, the place where all of this happened is now going to be remaking and reshaping the whole world. And people can see it, that they can't quite figure out, they can't predict what will happen. They see the dynamism, they see the changes. And they interpret this as a global movement of God's providence. And as God is renewing and saving the world, they had a very optimistic eschatology at the time. What's called a premillennial eschatology in Christianity, that the world would actually get really good and then Jesus would come back, we'd make this wonderful ice cream sundae and then Jesus, like the cherry, would be on the top, and the culmination of human progress. Slavery being abolished in the British Empire, things just getting better. And then as the Industrial Revolution, Democratic Revolution, I should also say, and by the way, among the things that they thought would happen would be the renewal of the great peoples of antiquity. The Greeks, the Romans, the Jews. It's a very literary culture back then. And so they've read the Bible, they've read the classics in Greek and Latin, and those people were incredible. They were the best people in the world. Look at them all now. And neither the Jews, nor the Greeks, nor the Italians were particularly inspirational to look at that point. But then you have, the Greek Revolution against the Ottomans, and that is this sort of outburst of liberty. All the celebrity culture goes there. Lord Byron dies romantically fighting for Greek independence.
1820?
Yeah, right. Then you get like the movement for Italian unification. In 1848, there's a republic proclaimed in Rome, and they overthrow the Pope. I mean, you can imagine how Americans were thrilled with this. Not the Irish Americans, but the other Americans. So it looks like liberty is blossoming. People are already saying, and by the way, the Jews will go back to the Holy Land. That, why are the Jews oppressed? Like the Greeks and like the Romans, the Jews are poor and degraded and all of this because they live under bad laws, right, under tyranny, okay, and because they've gotten, like in the Romans, they've been separated from the land, they're accursed in these ways. So the Jews will go back to the Holy Land. Like Americans, they'll farm and have democracy like good Jeffersonian Americans. And then the Jews will go from being the world's degraded, lowly people that everyone despises. You want to beat somebody up and have nothing happen, go find a Jew. And that everybody, despises them for cowardice and bad moral character and all of this. Well, they'll go to Israel, and American principles will remake them. And then the whole world will know that America is right, because everybody will be so amazed by what happens to the Jews. And so Americans are predicting that this is going to happen based on their reading of providential history and real history. And sort of, the realistic part of this is the Ottoman Empire is going into a terminal decline. So they can see that Palestine is going to be in some way up for grabs. So there's, even before there's a Zionist movement, there's a kind of a historical grounding, a political grounding for this perception.
And that's where Blackstone comes from, right?
Yes, yeah. Well, Blackstone has a different eschatology, but yes. But then you see what happens in, after 1848, things start turning ugly historically. People thought that the spread of enlightenment and brotherhood would redeem Eastern and Central Europe. I talk about the Imperial Zone in the book. That is Austrian Empire, Ottoman Empire, Russian Empire, after 1871, the German Empire. These are, even the German Empire, multinational, multi-confessional states. And they are almost all absolute monarchies in theory, though in practice they're kind of not very efficient. People in the West, that is England, America, to some degree France at the time, expected that as the principles of commercial civilization spread and enlightenment and all, that everything would get better in those countries. And everybody's sort of horrified to discover you get competing nationalisms, bloodshed. Think about 1850 to 1950 is a century of growing genocidal conflict across the Imperial Zone. That these different, in many ways what's happening in Syria and Turkey, Iraq today is part of this, that multi-ethnic, multi-confessional entities begin to fall apart and communities demand self-government one way or another. And you get the ethnic cleansing, we're going to have only Magyars in Hungary, and we're going to have only Czechs in Czechia, and on and on and on. And Americans are sympathetic to nationalism for a bunch of reasons, in part because the nationalists all say they want democracy, because under self-determination, nationalists will be able to have a nation. And the absolute monarchs, the emperors of Austria, Ottoman Sultan, Russian emperor, all hate nationalism like poison, and democracy. And America is a bad example, and also are anti-Semitic. You know, it all goes together. Anti-democracy, anti-nationalism, anti-American, anti-Semitic, anti-capitalist, because they sense that capitalism is this disruptive force. So Americans are seeing the nationalists as the good guys, but then there's the problem of what do we do about the Jews? You know, because obviously if you start parceling out Europe into ethnically homogeneous nation states, there's somebody who doesn't fit. You know, Jews and Gypsies, both of whom suffered Holocausts and have had real trouble. All right, so the Americans then in about, the sort of phase 2 of all this for the Americans comes in about really after the assassination of Alexander II? No, Nicholas, who's the good czar? Alexander II, that freed the slaves, the serfs. And then his son, Alexander III, goes into a huge anti-Semitic thing and starts literally driving Jews out of Russia. And you get a surge of Jewish and other immigration into the U.S. that begins in about 1880, the great wave that goes to 1924. And in the beginning, people don't think about it too much, but the wave grows. It's in percentage terms even bigger than the kind of immigration we've been having, and you know where that's going in terms of public reactions to it. And so, you know, you begin to get a reaction to it, but there's also the, you know, what's America going to do about all this stuff? There are all these wars in the Imperial Zone. They're starting to affect us. First by sending immigrants from 1880 to 1914, then world wars that we're getting involved in. And again, if you think about it, even today, the breakup of the old Imperial Zone, Ukraine, Syria, you know, these are where a lot of our biggest foreign headaches and dangers of wars are. And Americans between about 1880 and 1925 are trying to figure out what is the United States supposed to do about all this in our own interests and to the extent that we care in a humanitarian sense.
If I hear you correctly, though, underneath the American strategy that diverse Americans could get behind is an eschatology, or at least a sense of a direction of history and certain principles that if you follow will lead to success in history.
Right, but yes there is, but you see that's complicated by this, you know, when instead of leading to a new era of peace you get World War I and World War II and God knows what. So Americans then say, okay, well here's how we do it. What we're going to do is we are going to make sure that everybody has a state. Poles have a state, Irish have a state, Portuguese have a state, Spaniards have a state, Jews have to have a state. But then immigration to America is no longer the solution to the world's humanitarian disasters because it's your state. Run it well, enjoy it, run it badly, well we have no moral thing here, you screwed up, go deal with it. But also Americans believed that a world of nation states would, you know, based on democratic principles, would be peaceful. And it would not, so you could have a peaceful world that the United States wouldn't have to do a lot of meddling with to keep it peaceful, because all the countries would be democratic. Who would want war? Every nation would enjoy its own nation state. That's the basis in a lot of ways of American foreign policy in the 1920s and 30s. And the support for the Balfour Declaration absolutely comes out of the same kind of thinking that self-determination enters the 14 points. In that sense, you can think of the Balfour Declaration as a kind of 15th point.
I'll ask you one more question, then we'll open it up to
I'm sorry, I
the
talk
group.
forever when
No,
you...
but I want to force you to say something you haven't said.
Okay.
And maybe you don't want to say it, but so I'm gonna just push you toward it, because you started out and you mentioned Blackstone, who's coming at this from a distinctly religious point of view. But then when you described the sort of general framework, you described a rather secular view of history, right? But underneath it all, it's my feeling, and let me just make a thesis and then ask you what you think about it instead of trying to say this is what you think. I think that there is absolutely this sort of secular view of history you're talking about but that it's undergirded by an American religion, and that often the religion gets translated into a secular culture, and we're operating in a strategic framework and a strategic worldview that ultimately, if you check the DNA of the ideas and the worldview, you can see it goes back to religion.
Yep.
But we ourselves no longer we don't see that directly in our day-to-day conversations. We don't even recognize the religious roots, and we don't even think we have a distinctive worldview. We think we're just objectively, pragmatically examining what's going on in the world. Does that make any sense at all?
Well, I don't know what you mean by we there, but yeah.
We, the American elite.
Well,
Right?
you,
All
right.
You, members of the American
That's
elite.
like
who
that
went to
great Lone
Broadway.
Ranger joke. What you mean, paleface? What you mean, we? But look, there is a religious element. I was leaving the religious story out because it's kind of complicated, and there are really two different religious stories here, and that's one of the reasons it's complicated. American religion was, for much of its history, a very rare thing among religions, that it had an optimistic eschatology. Traditionally, religion looks at the end of the world as not a great time. There'll be a lot of wars. Then, it gets good at the end, but the sort of, the first scene of the last act is bad. And but really beginning in 17th century Britain, partly because they saw all of these things coming together for good for them, they started to imagine this idea of progress toward a universal thing, and it was conceived in religious terms, very much so. At the same time, other people who were secular, and again going back to 17th and 18th century Britain, would see it, and Adam Smith would conceive of an arc of history, but in a secular term. In God and Gold, I actually spend a lot of time talking about the relationship between the Abrahamic vision of history and liberal and Marxist secular visions of history, and arguing that they are in fact Abrahamic. And this is Abrahamic history, begins with prehistory, Garden of Eden, everything good. Then the fall into history, which the different Abrahamic religions do in different ways. And then God working in history to sort of redeem and work through. And then again, Christianity, Islam, and Judaism do this in different ways. But then at the end of history, God comes in and completes the work, and we sort of end up on a higher plane than we started out, and that's the redemptive work of God in history. Well, it ain't hard to see that in Marxism. Primitive communism, fall into class society, then this Hegelian, which is a Lutheran action of history conceived of atheistically, but still the same dialectic movement up, and then the culmination of communist utopia at the end. Same thing with Islam, but also obviously the same thing with liberal sort of enlightened thought generically. So the five faiths of Abraham, of Judaism, Christianity, Islam, liberalism, and Marxism. And one of the things people don't pay enough attention to, I think, is the way in which Abrahamic thought for the last 2,000 years has basically been dominating the earth. And in this sense, the Chinese Communist Revolution can be seen, or the liberal concepts in India, that even countries and cultures that remain formally non-Abrahamic in religious terms have bought into Abrahamic history as a model. It's actually quite extraordinary and well worth thinking about. But here's the thing, if you live in the world today, you do not have to be religious to believe in the apocalypse or to believe that the apocalypse is coming quickly. You can be an environmentalist and see that, believe that global warming, the accumulation of CO2 in the atmosphere, is going to lead to condition Venus, runaway greenhouse effect, or even just lead us to nuclear war because it raises resource wars and international competition. There are lots of ways now in which you can, as a secular person, completely secular person, your Abrahamic underlying view of history can lead you to this idea of apocalypse. Another way to speak of apocalypse is singularity. And you can have optimistic apocalypse and pessimistic apocalypse. So, in that sense, you're right. But this template, the special role of the Jewish people and Israel in this template is always very interesting. Now, Blackstone was a follower of D.L. Moody, who was a dispensationalist. And unlike the historically optimistic apocalypticism of a lot of the English-speaking world, he's a post-millennial, premillennial, that Jesus comes back and establishes a reign of peace. But when Jesus comes back, it's because everything has really melted down. Antichrist, worldwide reign of evil and terror, and so on and so forth. In other words, that human history is a tragedy and it will end in failure, and God will rescue us, or at least rescue the chosen, however we define the chosen. And so, as the world outlook begins to darken in the 19th century and the simple Enlightenment, progressive, everything gets better and better until the smooth culmination begins to look less and less likely, sort of dark apocalyptic ideas. Because people can still see that history is changing. Weapons are more destructive. The historicization of the eschaton. Boy, if you ever want to stop conversation, that's a great, it's really, one of the great trends of our times is the historicization of the eschaton. It's actually true.
We actually discussed that yesterday and today. Seriously.
Good, because it's important. In that sense, for Americans, the fact that the Jews started developing a Zionist movement in the 19th century was a sign of the last days. It's even more so, I think, and this very, very powerful. It's people now, we sometimes forget what a difference 1945 made in world history and culture. That you have two events or discoveries, in a sense. One is Russian troops, Soviet troops liberate Auschwitz, and there had been rumors of the Holocaust, talk of the Holocaust, but now what breaks out upon the world is evil that is, of supernatural quality, is a historical reality, and it happened in the most enlightened, best educated, technologically most advanced, and in many, many ways most admirable European country, Germany. And then a few months later, bang, in Hiroshima, you get the idea, you see that now ultimate destruction is possible. And so with those two things, the easy Enlightenment optimism that technology will improve human morality, and that we used to fight because we were ignorant and because resources were scarce. No, we fight because there's something in us that is off in some way. And then on the other hand, now our fighting can be so destructive that we can literally destroy all life on earth. Huge. And you go back and you read what people are writing at the time, the shock. They try to process this shock. It's immense. All right. Then, 1948, the State of Israel is proclaimed, which, again, on a whole spectrum of religious commitment and affiliation in the U.S., ranging from Bible-thumping fundamentalist, who just buys the whole package from A to Z, to person who had a kind of faintly religious upbringing, doesn't think about it all that much, but in some vague way still feels some attachment. That third thing, that Israel is restored after 2,000 years, is seen as a sign that, somehow or other the big guy is still upstairs and still thinking, and caring. And you can, this I think was particularly potent among many liberal Protestants and others who've been exposed to German Bible criticism, the higher criticism and all. And so okay, look, all right, fine. The book of Isaiah was actually, okay, it's 3 different books and they were written at different times. The book of Daniel is actually written after the events that it describes as prophecies. Okay, we get it, fine. But you know what? They prophesied a second return of the Jews, and the book of Isaiah was not written in 1949. So that it's sort of a way to say that whatever you think of these, liberal theological ideas, there's something there, something. And that something is real and powerful and is in history. And I think that actually, that message of cultural reassurance remains, even today, a very, very powerful force in the background of people's thinking in ways they're not always conscious about until something comes up. That's not the only pillar, by the way, of American support for Israel, but it's real. The idea that, the existence of Israel is a good thing, and it's not just a good thing for the Jews, it's a good thing for me, my family, my kids, my world. A very powerful element of American popular belief.
What's the name of the guy who wrote The True Believer?
Hofstadter?
No.
Hoffer.
Eric Hoffer. I think in that famous interview he did with Eric Sevareid, was it? So he did an interview, it's on YouTube. He said, if Israel doesn't survive, then history has no meaning. And I think that's basically what you're saying.
That's, people are very good at finding meaning. Probably they would, come up with something. But while it's there, it's a good thing. Now, in the Islamic world, a lot of this goes the other way, in the sense that, it's seen as the sign that history has gone decisively off the rails. And so that clash in the evaluation, it's not just a clash in the evaluation over whether you should put a positive or a negative sign in front of Israel in your historical accounting books, but also in sort of Anglo-American world. If you think about the last 300 years of history for us, they've been good. The British, 500 years, defeat the Armada, defeat Louis XIV, defeat Napoleon, defeat the Kaiser, defeat Hitler, defeat the Soviet Union. During all of that time, the world civilization is becoming more of a commercial, maritime, English-speaking order, just the way we like it, right? And that, progress is what we call that. But if you're in the Islamic world, you look at the world of 1700 and, the greatest European state, Ottoman Empire. Greatest Asian state, Mughal Empire. Persia at its height. The Islamic kingdoms of Africa are moving south. It's all good. And then 300 years later, it's all bad. And who broke the Mughal Empire? Oops, it was the British. Ottoman Empire, the British. Persian Empire, the British again. Nigerian sultanates, the British again. So Anglo-American hegemony has meant defeat, destruction, dismemberment, disempowerment, and disgrace for the Islamic world. And Israel sort of is the sort of latest stinging, is sort of both the symbol of all of that and an instrument of it. Right. So that in that sense, it's almost a mirror image that Israel for Americans looks like the visible sign of the triumph of a worldview, of a religion, of a culture. And in the Islamic world, it looks like, the greatest and worst stage yet in this ongoing defeat.
With that, let's open it up to a few questions. Jamie?
This may or may not be me, but talking right now. But I'm a, liberal atheist Jew, doesn't believe a word of the Bible. I support Israel. Why should I not be a little turned off by all these evangelical Christians who base their love of this country on things that were written thousands of years ago in this book that was supposedly written by the man in the sky, and the implications of which could lead to some if they actually carry them out in terms of political policy, could actually make things worse?
I guess if I were Jewish, the answer I might give is, there are a bunch of people out there who hate me for a bunch of reasons that I think are pretty ridiculous. At least there's also a bunch of people out there who like me for a bunch of reasons I think are pretty ridiculous. But I think there is, this is one of the themes I'm kind of trying to get at in this book too. Historically, anytime anybody tries to build a holistic society around a set of either a national identity, an ideology, or a religious commonality, sooner or later Jews become a problem there or have problems with it. So sort of the medieval Christian holistic society doesn't have room for Jews and sees Jews as the hateful outsider that must be expelled or attacked. In the 19th century, the new nationalisms find that, so Magyar nationalism must deal with the Jewish question, right? And so there's a kind of a real sense among Jews that is historically rooted to fear any sign of a kind of a coalescing of a holistic society around you, because it will turn on you in the end. I think there is a fear that many liberal Jews feel that kind of Jacksonian folk nationalist evangelical America, if it really got its head, would become this kind of total holistic society. And so you'll find, like, if you're Jewish, it's like you want to encourage the Mormons, too. You want to encourage like the other groups as well, because you know what it means when one group of people really gets together and kind of gets the bit between their teeth. So I think there actually are, I don't think, Jews will express their concerns about sort of right-wing nationalist, evangelical, Jacksonian pro-Zionism in various ways, but I think this is really where it's coming from. And it's, it is a legitimate response to a long history. What I would say, though, is that America, has never been a holistic society. That even if you go back to colonial times, you've got Puritans in Massachusetts, Quakers in Pennsylvania, Anglicans in Virginia, and that I don't actually think the Southern Baptists are going to take over.
So I'm curious, from taking a different approach, a little forward thinking. Given the centrality of this history towards bringing America to being as pro-Israel as it has been up to this stage, with the dramatic cultural and demographic shifts underway and foreseen, what perhaps is going to happen to the American character in terms of Israel, whereby some of this history is no longer quite as resonant or even perhaps as relevant in the next, say, 20 years, 30 years?
It's interesting. I mean, one thing would be that by the polling, support for Israel has never been higher than it is, that in fact, from they started polling on this in the late 1940s, really, and it's pretty continuous of growing support for Israel. And so, if this great demographic change is supposed to be changing everything, it's been remarkably slow to manifest. Now, you could say maybe it's going to be a lagging indicator. To some degree, the question you've asked, it boils down to two questions. One, as culturally Catholic Americans move away, increasingly far away from any sort of religious affiliation or identity, how will they think of themselves? And that is a very interesting question. If you look at the growth of the nones in America, the people who have no religious belief, a lot of this really is, it's part of a general breakdown of Catholic, ethnic, and social and cultural cohesion as generations after generations it evanesces. Liberal Protestants sort of happened to a generation ago. Where will that group go? And it's an unanswered question. Hispanics would be sort of the other interesting driving force. Again, we're talking about the future. I can't tell you the answer. I tend to be less pessimistic than some, because it looks to me that in terms of Hispanic immigration, at least, there's actually a lot more Americanization going on than people seem to think. One of the reasons that more people aren't aware of it is because until quite recently the number of Hispanic immigrants was growing so rapidly that there were always a lot more first generation than second. You weren't aware of second and third generation. It was the first. Now, interestingly, Asian immigration for the last few years has surpassed Latin America as the largest source of immigrants. And there's at least one study, that Pew study, that says for 5 years there was a net outflux of people back to Latin America from the U.S. So I don't know what's going to go on with that demographically. But if you look at some interesting cultural indicators, I would argue that Hispanic Americans are, if anything, more open to Anglo culture than most of the European immigrants were. One interesting index there would simply be, take a look at Protestantism. That, very few Greek, Russian, Jewish, Polish, Irish immigrants to the United States ever left the Catholic Church, and if they did, it probably wasn't for Protestantism. But if you look at something like 20% of Hispanics in the U.S. are Protestant, and that the Protestantization of much of Latin America continues. Now, what all this means, again, we're talking about big historic trends that our grandchildren will be debating the meaning of. But it does suggest to me that the kind of individualistic culture that American culture has stood for in the past has more appeal there than some people think. Also, I don't think Hispanics are going to assimilate into America as a racial group. I think they're going to assimilate as an ethnic group, or maybe a group of ethnic groups, as, by the way, I think Asian Americans will do. And that is a less problematic path. In 1900, Jews and Italians were not actually considered white by many Americans, and Jews perceived themselves as very much other in the United States. Now in Southern California, sort of Jews are Anglos, and nobody bats, of course they're Anglos. So are Sicilians. So the American identity actually has this sort of amazing capacity to expand and to embrace, some would say engulf. Now, what's going to happen, I don't know. It's the future. But I would not fall for the kind of deterministic, America's all going to be secular, atheist, post-American, post-Protestant, and therefore probably also anti-Israel. Though I think if it becomes all of those things, it's more likely to become anti-Israel.
Marianne?
Thanks. First, thank you so much for all the work that you do and helping us to parse this out. It's terrific.
Little secret is, it's fun. I enjoy it. You know, it's not
And
work.
I assign it in my classes. I may be the only person that does that in a very liberal college, but I do.
I hope you put a trigger warning on all.
No, don't do trigger warnings. I'm trying to get a handle. I get the evangelicals. I get, from your article and your work. I'm trying to get a handle on what the heck happened to the progressives in the Christian community.
Yep.
So you talk about how in going through and up through the Holocaust, and particularly after the Holocaust, the progressive Christians, the mainline progressive Christian denominations, saw their need to stamp out anti-Semitism and were very engaged on that and were pro-Israel. What happened to that?
Okay.
Because today, obviously, we know from the United Church of Christ and some of the other progressive mainline churches who are advocating BDS and are clearly associating with people that are bringing in anti-Semitism. It seems like in a very short time period, we've experienced a big shift.
All right.
In that side of.
Well, a couple of things going on. One is that actually the record wasn't as clear among progressive, let's call liberal Christians. So Reinhold Niebuhr felt himself to be an exception. And one of the reasons he founded, Christianity in Crisis, was that Christian Century, which was the flagship of liberal Protestantism, was actually anti-Zionist. One of the reasons one of the sources for anti-Zionism in American culture was the Protestant missionary community in the Middle East. In particular, Presbyterian, and they've been heavy on the BDS stuff, and especially around the American University of Beirut, which was founded by the Presbyterians. In fact, in many ways, Arab nationalism was kind of a product of American missionary work. That their idea was that if you could develop a secular identity for the Arabs based on culture and language, then Arab Christians would suffer less of a disability. And this was obviously a message Arab Christians loved, and as many of you know, there's a significant group of the Arab Christian community today that is, if anything, more anti-Zionist than Muslims, it's a way of earning their way into, tolerance for them, and to appeal to this idea. A lot of what George Habash, a number of the theoreticians of extreme Palestinian resistance to Israel come out of that milieu. So I forget the man's name now. I think it might have been Philip Dodge, tried to persuade Wilson to give up Balfour Declaration. He was on the board of American University Beirut. So there's always been that element. More generally, the same forces are working in American liberal Christianity that are working in American liberal Judaism. That for the first, that when Jews were the underdogs and oppressed, then there was a natural sympathy for them. Again, both of these groups, liberal Judaism and American liberal Protestantism, have theological and cultural roots in 19th century German theological liberalism, Protestant theological liberalism. And one of the things that begins to happen is you start getting a critical attitude toward your own people, your own interest. You want to subject your own nation and its claims, your own culture and its claims, in as impartial a way as you can to judgment by universal law. And that was, Reform Judaism, which owes a lot culturally and intellectually to liberal Protestantism in 19th century Germany, interpreted sort of, as a way of, connected with elements of classical Jewish thought about the exile being a mission, to be dispersed among the peoples to teach principles of righteousness and so on, but also, that nationalism was of the past, that in a way, thanks to exile and dispersion, the Jews had transcended nationalism and were now to be known as a people of ethics, of universal ethics, because freed from the burden of a state with the raison d'etat that goes with that, the Jews could live the pure ethical life in a way that others couldn't, and so be a shining light. Well, liberal American Protestantism, you think about their role in the anti-war movements, in the sort of attacks generally on racism and what's wrong in American history for decades and centuries, are applying that same sort of corrosive, but they would say healthy and needed criticism out of these universal ethical principles. And so obviously the state of Israel needs to be held to the same standard as other nations. Once Israel is in a position where Palestinians are its subjects on the West Bank or what have you, and no longer is Israel receiving tens of thousands of oppressed Jews from the Arab world and so on, then there's a sense of moral balance tipping. But also among liberal Protestants, there is the same, when Jamie was talking about problems with Jacksonians and Zionists, liberal Protestants have the same kind of instinctive revulsion to these full-throated nationalist Jacksonians who don't really believe in subjecting the United States of America to international institutions, norms, and so on, who sort of see the preservation of the nation as a highest good, etc. Is this making sense? Yeah. And so I think we need to see, liberal Judaism and liberal Protestantism, or liberal Christianity more generally, are very, very close in many ways, and the same kinds of cultural forces are at work in both. They are more similar than conservative Christianity and Orthodox Judaism, because there are, it's the liberals who have approached a meeting point.
Right. Well, maybe we should call it a night, Walter. Thank you very much. It's incredibly interesting.
Thank you.